Good afternoon. Welcome to the Global Security Forum here at the National Liberal Club in London. Welcome to our audience who are here at the National Liberal Club and everybody out there who is watching online. You're very welcome indeed. We're discussing today the new way of war. Russia, Ukraine, how will it end? Rather like the novels of Thomas Hardy, people say, does it end happily? No, but happily it does end. There will be an end to this war. These days will pass, and we need to think now about how it might end and what comes next. I'm delighted that we have here today Professor Mark Galeotti, who also has his book. It's not being launched today, it came out in February, but his book, The Weaponisation of Everything, is out and is well worth looking at. We'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And we have Sir Peter Westmacott, very distinguished ex-diplomat, who will discuss some of the things that Mark is going to talk about. Before we get going, I should, as a matter of housekeeping, just deal with the next meeting, and the next meeting of the Global Security Forum is on the 22nd of June. It is a morning meeting from 10:30 to 12, and it is the 8th collaboration between the Global Security Forum and what's known as CSOX, which is the Southeast European Studies at Oxford. And the subject there will be the weaponisation of migration, so not a million miles away from what we're speaking about now. And I should say that the question and answer session in this meeting will be both from the floor in the normal way, but also from everybody out there online. If you want to ask a question, then submit it as a Q&A in the way that you can online, and we will curate them. I will see them on a screen, and I'll try and integrate cyber questions with questions from the floor. If you want to see this event afterwards, you can see it on YouTube, and you can get the details for that by looking at the Global Security Forum website, which is www.globalsecurityforum.org, all one word, www.globalsecurityforum.org, all one word. Or you can see it on Twitter at hashtag GSF Events Day, all one word, hashtag GSF Events Day. So it's all available there. Finally, I'm enjoined to remind everybody that since we're now back up and running after COVID, and what a relief that is, our expenses are now climbing again. So for those of you who are members, please look out your subscriptions and pay them. And for those of you who are not members, please become a member and pay your subscription. Jacqueline Jinks, who facilitates everything that happens at GSF, enjoined me to make everyone feel guilty. So I hope you're feeling suitably guilty. Right, let's go straight on. Mark Galeotti has produced his book, The Weaponisation of Everything. It's a very good book. It is a book that deals with so many themes that we are grappling with now in this Ukraine-Russia war. The themes of information and social media and cyber and space, as well as what happens on the ground. I mean, he started this book before the war, but my goodness, it couldn't be more timely. I don't think he's here to sell the book, but I'm sure it will sell, and copies are available at £15 discount. Cards only. We don't do anything with cash these days. Cards only, but £15 if you want to buy it afterwards. But I'm delighted to invite Mark to open our meeting now. He's a senior non-resident fellow at the Institute of International Relations in Prague. He has been a Jean Monnet Fellow at the European University. He has taught at Kiel University, at New York University, at Rutgers in Newark. He's been at the IMO in Moscow, and he's been an advisor to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He'll be known to many of you from his now regular columns in the Sunday Times, plus everything else he's written. And his books, his most recent books, I really enjoy some of these recent ones. The Russia's Super Mafia was a very timely book in 2018, Russia's Political War in 2019, and the one I enjoyed most, We Need to Talk About Putin in 2019. My goodness, do we need to talk about Putin. So, Mark, it's great to see you here. Thank you for your time. Let me ask you to open it up in terms of not just what you've written in The Weaponisation of Everything, but how you now apply that to the Ukraine crisis, which you just managed to get in, I see, before you had to submit the final manuscript. So well done for that.
Well, yes, quite, but not the invasion. But anyway, thanks very much for the invitation. Great to be here. I mean, there is a natural solipsism. When Putin invaded Ukraine, my first thought was how terrible for 44 million Ukrainians. My second thought was actually how terrible also for 145 million Russians. And of course, my third thought was how terrible for me, personally. Because here I had just produced this book that talked about how old-style, kinetic, boots-on-the-ground warfare was becoming less and less relevant in the 21st century. Less and less, shall we say, appealing as an option for a whole variety of reasons. It's becoming increasingly more expensive. And I don't just mean expensive in terms of kit, though we nowadays have this phrase, exquisite, these exquisite systems. Exquisite has become the euphemism for eye-wateringly expensive. It's an example from the book that I probably overuse, is if you take all the interceptors that protected these islands during the Battle of Britain in World War II, all the Spitfires, all the Hurricanes, take their value together and then sort of adjust it to modern money, you could buy about 6 of the all-new singing and dancing F-35 aircraft. Now, admittedly, an F-35 is extraordinarily more capable than a Spitfire, but 6. Some of them are going to be offline for maintenance. Occasionally, as we discovered, some of them can fall off the deck of an aircraft carrier. And anyway, they can't be everywhere. Everything has got more expensive. Also, lives have got more expensive. I mean, even authoritarian regimes these days have to think more carefully. They face either the cost of actually having to train proper soldiery or actually the political backlash. Why for so long did Putin pretend that there were no Russian troops in the Donbass? Was it because he thought one day he just lies once more and we'll believe him? Of course not. It's because he's actually lying to his own people, because he knew that there was no enthusiasm for sending boys into the Donbass before the current war. It's expensive in terms of international law. We complain about the limits of international law and so forth, but actually, we are in a totally different world. If we think of the things that Putin does, a Napoleon, a Bismarck, probably quite a few British foreign ministers too, of the time, would have seen nothing unusual. It was once upon a time quite normal that large powers, powerful nations, impose their will on smaller ones. The fact that we are now horrified that this is a moral as well as a political issue, it says something about how far the world has changed over the period of a little more than a century, frankly. So there are lots more costs, but also actually the value. I mean, the days when national wealth could be measured in terms of coal mines and acres of farmland and so forth are long since gone. Yes, of course, oil, gas, they certainly have their value. But if you invade Silicon Valley or the City of London, you don't suddenly acquire the technological innovation or the financial entrepreneurship, let's call it, of each of those places. No, they will just slip through your fingers and they will move to some other venue. Instead, what we find is a situation in which actually, yes, nations are still going to compete with each other. They still have their rivalries. But often, in my opinion, it will be sublimated out into whole new realms of economic warfare. I mean, let's be honest, when we talk about sanctions, we might like the word sanction because it sort of sounds more, again, morally justified. But let's be honest, this is economic warfare. Political warfare, cultural warfare. We're seeing the use of cyber attacks, but we're also seeing the use of law, national and international, being pressed into service. There are all these other kind of non-kinetic realms. And those can be phenomenally powerful. That was my basic argument. And then what does Putin do? He invades. However, it soon became clear that if there's one key lesson I want you to think about from the Ukraine invasion, it is this: that Putin should have read my book first. That's the important thing. Because look, up to that point, he was winning. He had assembled this massive force along Ukraine's borders, 140,000 troops, but was not using them. They were sitting there, and every time we sort of said, well, why are you doing this? They just said, oh, they're there on exercise. And anyway, they're on our turf. Under that intimidatory pressure, the Ukrainian economy was tanking, first of all. Who was going to invest in Ukraine under the shadow of a Russian tank? Secondly, a stream of foreign visitors and dignitaries of every kind was flowing into Moscow, putting Putin in exactly the position he wants to be, that position of geopolitical and global centrality, that they have to come to him as supplicants. And we also know that a fair number of European governments, I won't say which ones to spare their blushes, especially while I'm on camera, but were actually behind the scenes beginning to bring pressure to bear on President Zelensky to make concessions to the Russians, all in the name of avoiding war. If he had really been this Machiavellian player of three-dimensional geopolitical chess that we've been told for so long, Putin would have just continued the same thing. And as one more date in which the American or the British intelligence services are saying, oh, we think there might be an invasion imminent, passes, at a certain point he could have turned to the Europeans and said, so why were the Americans lying to you? And what else do you think they might have been lying to you about? Umpteen opportunities at minimal cost. But no, for whatever reason, and we can talk about that in the discussion if you like, Putin wasn't willing to do that. I think, frankly, Putin doesn't understand the 21st century as part of the problem. And I would suggest that the moment that his tanks rolled over the border was the moment he started losing. Now, I don't mean to say it's going to be quick or easy. I think, unfortunately, we're heading a situation in which both sides will be too strong to be beaten, but too weak to win. We may well be heading for a rather lengthy and ugly stalemate. But still, at that point, he, I think, had demonstrated, well, obviously, apart from an utter cluelessness about modern Ukraine, he had a strategy that was entirely predicated on this notion that this non-country with a non-people would not in any way resist, and the slightest push and the whole thing will collapse. And in a few days, he could have imposed a puppet regime, and that would be that. But what we now see is, in effect, two wars being fought. We have a very, very 20th century war being fought within Ukraine itself, Ukraine against the Russians. And we have a very 21st century war being fought by the West against Russia, a war that is precisely about economics, but it's also about politics, it's about culture. In its own way, it's about history, it's about law. All these actual fronts are being mobilized. And I think it's worth flagging that up now, because I think this is going to be one of the key things we have to be thinking about in the future. At present, these two wars are entirely synchronized. We say that basically it is up to the Ukrainians to decide when this war is over, and so long as they're willing to fight for their motherland, we will defend them, we will support them, as long as it doesn't mean actually any of our boys going and fighting and dying there. But there may well come a point when actually these two wars come out of sync. There may be a point, for example, in which the Ukrainians want to push further than we actually feel comfortable about. Let's say into Russian territory. There may be a point when the Ukrainians wanted to strike a deal, and there are certain Western countries that say, no, 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 this is not the right deal. This does not weaken Putin enough. This does not humiliate Putin enough. Are we actually going to tell Zelensky, sorry guys, we want you to keep fighting? I mean, these are just things about the future. At present, there is no question but that there is a considerable degree of harmony between a West, which to a degree Zelensky has played effectively and mercilessly. I mean, he has proven to be an extraordinary advocate for his country's interests. And one of the reasons is because he doesn't play by the rules of, shall we say, international etiquette. He calls people out. He challenges. He asks for things he's not going to get. I remember talking to a parliamentarian after he had spoken to the British House of Parliament. And they said, the trouble is it's really hard to say no to Zelensky. And particularly because he keeps asking for a no-fly zone to be imposed. But let's be honest, a no-fly zone is just a polite way of saying an aerial combat zone. It would actually mean NATO planes engaging with Russian planes and Russian air defenses. And obviously, we have not the desire for that. But in some ways, the view is, well, Zelensky keeps asking for it because, in a way, we use up our no on that. And in order to kind of feel better, we give him other things that we might not otherwise have given him. He has played us very, very effectively. And that's not a criticism, quite the opposite. That's his job. In these circumstances, Ukraine is fighting an existential struggle for its sovereignty, its autonomy, its independence. All bets are off in those circumstances. But again, that's another point I'd want to make. The degree to which, even within this very close alliance in which we are supporting the Ukrainians so effectively, the Ukrainians are also deploying information warfare against us to make us think the right thing. to make us believe that we ought to be supporting them. And sometimes that will mean actually downplaying their own losses for fear of scaring away supporters, and sometimes it might mean actually talking up the threat. And again, none of that is a criticism. It's just to emphasize one of the points that I make in my book, which is actually the degree to which, in a way, we are heading much more clearly, to a degree we've already been there, but much more clearly into a world in which conflicts, because they are often undeclared, are not only hard to end. How do you end a war that you haven't formally started? But also sometimes hard to notice. Hard to notice when actually another country is using various instruments against you to try and make you do what it wants, because that is what war is about. War is just simply a way of making another country do something it doesn't want to do. So I think in this respect, I mean, the Ukrainian war is a fascinating case study of this new way of war, in which, yes, guns and tanks still have their place. But to be honest, I mean, what's really going to rip the heart out of Putin's state? It's not going to be the admittedly terrible losses that it's suffering on the battlefield. It's actually going to be the fact that not just so long as the war is being fought, but I would suggest for a long time, really as long as Putin is in the Kremlin, there will continue to be economic sanctions. There will continue to be all kinds of political measures. There will not be a forgive and forget moment where we actually could go back to where we were 3 months ago, or even, let alone 8 years ago. That is basically the rock on which the Putin system will break. And that is exactly an example in which actually the modern West, precisely because it is interconnected, because it is economically, technologically, and culturally vibrant and dynamic, actually does have all kinds of other instruments of power. They may not wear camouflage, but they are effective just the same. I'll stop there.
Mark, thank you very much. I don't think you should be so apologetic, really, about the agenda for your book, because as I read it, it was all about the interaction of soft and hard power. Actually, that I've been interested in soft power for a long time, and what we take as soft power, information, all the rest of it, actually only really counts when it's part of a spectrum of all sorts of power. And I get that from the book every page, to be honest. Anyway, right, let's move straight on. Our second speaker is Sir Peter Westmacott, another great friend of the Global Security Forum. And I won't try and go through Sir Peter's extensive CV, except to pick out a couple of things. He was Private Secretary to His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales. He was Director for the Americas in the Foreign Office from 1997 to 2000. And then there were 3 really interesting ambassadorial appointments. He was British Ambassador to Turkey from 2002 to 2006. He was British Ambassador to Paris, to France, from 2007 to 2012, the most coveted of all of the Foreign Office postings. And then he was British Ambassador to the United States from 2012 to 2016, the most important of all US diplomatic postings. So to hold the most coveted and the most important back-to-back tells you quite a lot about Sir Peter Westmacott's standing in the Foreign Office and his own wealth of experience. Peter, it's great to see you here. The Turkey ambassadorship is the one that's on all of our minds at the moment, but I don't want to lead you too far. Let me ask you for some comments around the general topic of how does this end?
Thank you, Michael. And the sharper, the more observant amongst you will have realized that Moscow did not feature in the list of places where I have served. And as one of my former colleagues kindly noted, you don't know anything about Russia. What are you doing sitting in front of us today? Or Ukraine, for that matter. And that is indeed true. But I'm delighted to be here to perhaps offer a slightly different or more general perspective. I loved what Mark had to say and learned a great deal from it. But like everybody else who is in the foreign policy business, I too talked to a few Russians, a few Ukrainians, different friends in different parts of the world, security people and the rest, and have a couple of comments which I'd just like to make. And then perhaps I'd like to say a few words about the bigger picture, as well as how does this end and what does it mean, if you like, for our broader security interests. A couple of things about the invasion of Ukraine. I think the Russian invasion was bolder, more aggressive than any of us would have expected, and a great deal less competent than people might have expected, given the way in which we've seen Russian military capabilities built up over the years. I've been struck, talking to friends from a number of different countries, that those who do know Vladimir Putin and have dealt with him over the years were pretty well unanimously saying to me beforehand, or indeed admitted afterwards, they didn't think he was going to invade Ukraine. because he didn't need to. It didn't make sense. He'd got Crimea. He got lots of little green men running around in Donbass. Everything he had done before to embarrass NATO, upset the equilibrium, push the greater Russia idea, had one way or another been deniable. Perhaps not plausibly deniable, but deniable. And so he was able to lie through his teeth and sort of get away with it, even to the extent of fabricating the evidence that MH17 was not shot down by Russian missiles in Ukraine back in 2014. And as somebody rather sort of cynically said to me in Washington, when I said, well, you know, why do you think he went when Biden was in the White House and not when his friend Trump was there? The answer was, well, he didn't need to, because he got all he wanted from Trump without having to invade Ukraine. So it's sort of puzzling to me that those who knew him and understood how this man had worked didn't think he would do it because it didn't really make sense. Whereas those who were relying on the extraordinary intelligence, which I was broadly aware of from French friends, American friends, of course, British friends, were very sure that this was going to happen. Some of them even gave me the day, a few days in advance, though I'm not privy to the intel, when this was going to happen. And even though they didn't know the guy, they thought that the evidence was very clear. And as you were just saying, why would he do that, given that if he hadn't done it, he could say, look, the rest of you were lying once again, and he could continue to put out his own narrative. But he did. And so here we are in a situation which certainly the experts, apart from the intel people, didn't really expect. The second thing is, of course, that this is an invasion which was very old-fashioned, long lines of armor, thought he'd get to Kiev in a couple of days, thought he would be able to take an airfield outside the city and use that as a launch pad to capture Kiev. Total annihilation of the airborne division that arrived. And goodness me, within a couple of days, the rest of the world had woken up to the fact that Ukraine had not collapsed in 36 hours. It had obviously shocked Vladimir Putin, shocked his military commanders who hadn't really done their homework and hadn't done a very good job of training and equipping their own people. But the rest of us, who were very, very clear that once he had crossed the border, it was not in our interest for Putin to win, realized that here was a very courageous country with a comedian who had risen to the role of national leader with extraordinary skill and effectiveness, and it behoved the rest of us to support them. And so we scurried around a bit. To give the United Kingdom some credit, I think it is the case that probably more than most other countries way back, perhaps the exception of the United States, since 2014, we had been doing some quite useful training and provision of defensive equipment, modestly, to the Ukrainian armed forces in case this day ever happened. But in general, the rest of us hadn't done a great deal about this and hadn't really expected the invasion to take place. And then we all jumped to it, and large quantities of Javelin and other anti-tank weapons and other military equipment, including, from my Turkish friends, some rather effective, cheap and cheerful, off-the-shelf drones, which are doing apparently a very good job, just as they already had in Libya and just as they had in the Caucasus in the last war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Happened to be made by President Erdogan's son-in-law, which may or may not have something to do with the way in which they've been sold around the world. So there we were, not in a position where anyone had expected, Ukraine putting up a much better fight than anyone thought, Russia doing a great deal worse, not conducting some of the cyber and other alternative forms of warfare that one might have expected, and I'm not an expert enough to comment on why that should be, but making a pretty good hash of the rest of it. And so the rest of us who watched aghast at the slaughter with the most monitored and observed military conflict the world, I think, has ever known, there is all the evidence for war crimes trials and whatever else we end up with in the future. We both, A, realized that this was not a cakewalk for Russia, and that it was in our interest that Putin, not famous for backing down in a military conflict, could not be allowed to win. But secondly, saying to ourselves, how the hell does this end? Because this is just terrible, and the suffering is enormous. The longer it goes on, the more likely it is that the one with the capabilities and the numbers and the size to win probably eventually will get there. And so therefore, it's very important that Ukraine should be propped up, supported, as long as Ukraine wished to fight. not our decision, their decision, and kept in the game as long as necessary, unless and until there is some sort of negotiation. Now, when I talk to the odd Russian, or indeed the odd oligarch, as I have done, lots of others will have done as well, what I'm struck by is, one, how even a lot of expatriate Russians give me a lecture about how actually Putin had a point, and this was largely our fault, and it was NATO provocation, and we should have understood, and we shouldn't have allowed Russia to be humiliated after the collapse of the Soviet Union. You know, all that stuff, even from diaspora Russians, exiles. My oligarch chum, who was one of the very wealthy enablers of putting Putin on his throne way back when they thought that he would be malleable rather than what he has become, gave me a similar lecture, but also said, look, if we get to the point where there's a negotiation, a couple of points for you guys. One, you do not need to give him Donbass. Donbass was pro-Russian, is largely Russian-speaking, but it's been created into a mafia state by the Kremlin with little green men and crooks running around the place, and they do not wish to be a part of Russia. Just as my friend would say, you know, most countries which were part of the Warsaw Pact or indeed the Soviet Union and escaped from it, not many of them are lining up to go back for the privilege of being once again occupied by a Russian body politic or body military. You don't need to give it because those people do not wish to be Russian. And so do not think that in any negotiated settlement that has to be on the table. It doesn't. And then the second point was, but Crimea does, because that's de facto already in Russian hands. And if you want to have a negotiated settlement with Putin, I don't see how you're not going to give that away. Now, the problem with that sort of talk, and there are people I've heard in London and Washington and elsewhere, and Paris and Germany, who are saying, yeah, but we'll have to give him more than that, because otherwise how can Putin possibly declare victory? You know, there is that debate to be had. The other debate is that amongst frontline states, and look at the very interesting interview the Prime Minister of Estonia gave to New York Times yesterday, Putin must be defeated. We cannot allow aggression to win. You know, here is a lady aged 40, Prime Minister of Estonia, whose mother was deported to Siberia for 10 years of her life as a child because the Russians were busy trying to eliminate any sense of Estonian identity from Greater Russia. There are similar stories coming, you know, from Latvia and from other parts of the near abroad, if you like, for Russia. A lot of people who live on the border with Russia are not keen to see any sort of wishy-washy diplomatic, let's give him something, let's give him an off-ramp where he can declare victory and show the Russian people that he's won something. How do we reconcile that sense from those who know what it's like to be either occupied by or live right next to a bullying Vladimir Putin, and with the position where Putin is at the moment? The gap, seems to me, is really a very wide one, as Mark was just saying, and the likelihood must be that for the time being, the horror will continue, not least because none of the rest of us who believe in sovereign independent nation states, rule of law, or human rights, want to see Putin win this illegal, unprovoked, dishonest war of aggression. So is there anybody who can persuade Putin that this is not actually in Russia's interests? Apart from possibility of continuing military, if not defeat, then certainly massive damage to his armed forces. I mean, I have the unoriginal thought that the obvious person is Xi Jinping, who at the moment is sitting on his hands. We will all remember that 3 or 4 days before the 24th of February, there was China saying in the Security Council of the United Nations, there can be no exception to sovereign independence right of a nation state to have its own borders and, you know, not be invaded by any other country. And then a week later, it was saying, well, actually, we need to take account of Russia's legitimate security interests after all, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, they've got half an eye on Taiwan. They've got half an eye on other interests in Russia. They've got half an eye on the idea that they don't want the idea of the concept of there being some sort of unanimously accepted liberal international order becoming accepted, because that's not what they want, it's not what Putin wants, it's not what a number of other autocrats around the world would want. And yet, whereas I feel, without being a Russian expert at all, that whereas Putin doesn't really mind about the human suffering or the damage to the global economy, or even some of the damage to the Russian economy, he could still sell oil and gas, and he's stolen very large sums of money already. China actually has an interest in the global economy surviving. It owns several trillion dollars of US debt. Its prosperity comes from being part of the global economy, the fact that everybody's supply chains, until very recently, started in China. It would like to control, but it doesn't want to destroy. So the longer this goes on, I can't help thinking that it might just be in the interest of Xi Jinping, who's got a few other domestic issues on his mind, by the way, to have a phone call with his good chum. Can President Biden do anything? Well, you know, we all know that when Xi Jinping was number 2 and Biden was number 2 in the Obama administration, they spent a long time going around America together. There is a relationship there. There may not be much of a Putin-Biden relationship, but there is a Xi Jinping-Biden relationship. Just possibly some sort of conversation could take place in that area. But, you know, I'm to some extent clutching at straws here. How does it come to an end, therefore? We need to have some of those conversations. The pressure needs to remain against Russia militarily. We need to continue to support Ukraine. I don't think it's up to us to start dictating to them how much they should be putting on the table as part of a negotiation. That isn't our role, and that we need to be very clear about. Two other final little comments I would make. One is, again, statement of the blindingly obvious. Isn't it interesting how one of Putin's objectives was to weaken NATO? And yet what he's done is actually strengthen that alliance. He's even got the Germans committing to spending a lot more money on defense equipment. The alliance suddenly looks a whole lot more relevant than it was, and we've got new members lining up at the door, which curiously Putin is now saying he doesn't have a particular problem with Sweden and Finland joining NATO, whereas he was adamantly opposed a few days ago. But I'm sure that was not one of the objectives, that Western security would look stronger. Second thing I would say from a parochially British point of view, whereas I'm one of those people who regret that as part of the Brexit negotiation, we declined to have any structured foreign and security policy cooperation with our our erstwhile EU partners. We have now got back into the habit of talking about foreign policy and security on the back of the need to coordinate our positions on Ukraine. And just maybe we will discover that it's not a bad thing to be talking to friends and allies rather than to be trying to go it alone as global Britain. I don't know where that's going to go. Some interesting ideas have come out from President Macron about how one could build new relationships between the European Union and non-EU member states if they were interested in integrating different aspects of public policy. Quite interesting thoughts there. Let's see where that goes. Much will depend on trust and on human relationships. Some of it will depend even on where we go in the coming weeks on the future of the Northern Ireland Protocol. But that's a different subject. So I think one of the things where we are is that the alliance is looking stronger. International cooperation on security issues is looking better. But we are still a long way away from something that looks like an outcome which will stop the slaughter and will avoid rewarding illegal, unprovoked aggression.
Thank you. And just very briefly, Peter, President Erdogan of Turkey. You understand Turkey better than most people in this room. Can President Erdogan really prevent Sweden and Finland joining NATO?
Theoretically, he can, though there are some better NATO experts in this room than me. I mean, you have to have unanimity if you're going to have new people joining the alliance. I think what he is doing is marking our card that Turkey wishes to be given due respect for the fact that it's got terrorists and other sort of problems, as well as migration issues, in its own territory. The narrative on public television in Turkey has tended to be this is largely the fault of the West. Actually, it's a bit like that in France at times, sometimes. And so the public opinion is ready to believe that American imperialism and so on is part of the reason why this is happening. And he does, therefore he's to some extent playing to the gallery and saying you cannot take Turkey for granted in terms of NATO expansion when this is a little bit NATO's fault. He's also still very bothered about Kurdish terrorism, and it is the case that in Sweden there's a big Kurdish community. I don't see any evidence at all for Kurds or Finns or Swedes or Norwegians or anybody else actively supporting or going along with Kurdish terrorism. But this is a hot-button issue for Erdogan. It was ever since the whole violent conflict with the PKK in southeastern Turkey began. It was again brought to the surface when the United States and the rest of us chose to back Kurdish groups in northern Syria because they were the most effective of the guerrilla organizations against Bashar al-Assad. And those Peshmerga groups in northern Syria and in northern Iraq do happen to be pretty closely allied with the PKK. So they've got a sort of a point. So I think what he's doing is saying, what about our interests? He cannot be serious in saying you've got to extradite some of the people that we've applied for. On the whole, I'm sorry to say, a Turkish application for extradition tends to be to send a box of press cuttings to a foreign capital and say, send us this person. And I don't know anybody who's ever extradited a Kurdish Turk back to Turkey on the basis of those applications. So I think that's, to some of that, is window dressing. And of course, you know, the most obvious thing to say is that in a year's time, Turkey is due to have presidential and parliamentary elections. The economy is in dire straits. The president will want to be showing that he is waving the flag, and certainly making a stand against terrorism goes down very well, and making something of a stand against imperialist Westerners and suggesting that Turkey must not be taken for granted also goes down well with the voters.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on to questions. We'll get as many as we can. Lord Howell of Guildford, you will need a microphone, David, which is on its way, partly because of the broadcasting that we're doing. Okay. And then Lord Howell, and then I can see Lord West at the back, sir? Yes, okay, you're next after Lord Howell.
Lovely.
So, David.
Thank you. Two fabulous presentations. And those last remarks by Peter Westmacott on Xi Jinping and China lead me to my question, which is this. We've heard about the two wars from the professor, and that's right. But what about the third war, which is roughly the one that's globally dividing the entire world between those prepared to accept the Western point of view and those who are not condemning and coming very near condoning the butchery in the Ukraine. And that includes, as a matter of passing fact, half the Commonwealth. It's not a question of our friends being on our side. A lot of our so-called friends, including the Middle East, where they're playing very negatively on oil production or extra oil production, are really on another side. As long as there's that situation, with half the world really saying, well, the Russians are okay, we want to keep in with them, we're not going to get all that far, are we, with Western sanctions? Okay.
Mark, yes, the rest of the world is holding off, seeing what happens.
Well, on the one hand, I mean, we shouldn't underestimate the power of Western sanctions, because if nothing else, I mean, actually, I say Western sanctions, American sanctions. It's the secondary dollar sanctions, which in some ways force everyone to make certain decisions about whether or not they're willing to trade with the Russians, and if so, at what cost. And that is, shall we say, a strength in economic terms and a weakness in political terms, because one of the key issues on which both Russian and Chinese disinformation and political campaigns in the global south has been focusing on is precisely, you see, this is exactly what we were talking about. This is American neo-colonialism. They're trying to basically conscript you into their war against Russia. I mean, Putin's a line that he has taken is, this is not actually about Ukraine. Ukraine is simply the battlefield in which we are taking on the West, and that means America and its sort of spear carriers. And that's simply because we weren't willing to bend the knee to Western imperialism, and that's why they're trying to humble us. And I mean, on one level, it's a ridiculous narrative, but it does have certain appeals in the global south. And I think this is one of my concerns, is that I think too often we are thinking, well, all right-thinking people agree with us, and all the countries we talk to, are in agreement. In fact, actually, for many, this is a Western, European, northern conflict that a lot of other people in the south are going to pay the consequence, pay the price for. If we look at, for example, the food price increase, that's going to hit the global south really hard. And unfortunately, so far at least, and I think this is all to be played for, but so far, in many cases, this is not regarded as because of Russia's war. It's regarded wrongly, but regarded honestly nonetheless as because of Western sanctions. So I think there is a lot more to be done there. You're absolutely right. I wouldn't say it's a war necessarily. I think it's just that we have neglected to appreciate that in a globalized world, we need allies who are often going to be countries, or not allies, but situational partners, who are not countries that naturally share our values and our systems and so forth. And we haven't yet articulated a narrative that says to them why they should care. I mean, actually, there is a narrative. But in fact, it is about a set of international norms which protect everybody. But as I said, I think at the moment we haven't yet really done that well.
Okay. Peter, just a quick one on that. I mean, in the UN, 5 nations voted in favour of Russia, 35 abstained. So if you take those 40 nations, that's more than half the global population represented by those leaderships. That's pretty bleak, isn't it?
Yeah. I think, as Mark was suggesting, there's quite a lot of allegation suggestion this is neocolonialism. There's also a lot of whataboutism. Look what you lot did in Iraq. Look what you lot did in Libya. Yeah. How dare you say that when Russia's got its own legitimate interests that it can't take some sort of action. And I think we should not forget either that both Russia and China have put quite a lot of pressure on some of those other countries not to go along with condemning the Russian invasion. They've got a lot of economic leverage, those countries, and so some, I think, didn't want to go along with the Western consensus, but were also persuaded to, not to do so. One quick comment on sanctions. Sanctions, I don't think we've ever seen international sanctions of quite such an extraordinary extent that we've now got against Russia, and I think Putin must be a bit surprised about it. We need to be very clear with sanctions. What are we trying to achieve? Often they don't achieve very much. I do think sanctions got Iran back to the negotiating table for the JCPOA back in summer, well, which ended in the summer of 2015, and we ended up with international sanctions having a real effect. Didn't stop the nuclear program, did get them to the negotiating table. Sanctions also, I think experts would say, made a big difference over the ending of apartheid in South Africa. What we have got with sanctions at the moment is very wide-ranging, which stop every Russian citizen using a credit card, getting on an aeroplane, taking a holiday in Turkey or wherever they want to do so. What worries me a little bit is that whereas it makes good sense to target the Putin enablers, the people who can have an influence on him, perhaps, we risk storing up a great deal of resentment against many, many thousands of Russians who can't bear the man, but for understandable reasons tend to keep their heads down. And if we are not able to start lifting those sanctions when things get better, then I think the risk is that the successor generations of Russian leaders and non-leaders, just public opinion, is going to be more and more convinced that the rest of the world is out to get them, and we've got to be rather careful about that.
Yeah, thank you. Right, we've got 17 minutes for this. No, so we'll get through as many as we can. Lord West, sir.
Thank you very much. I agree with much of what was said. Michael will be delighted that I'm not going to bang on about hard power, but my goodness me, we forget about it at our peril. We know that now, don't we? Even allowing for the rest. My question relates to nuclear. Do you think that what has happened has actually increased the likelihood of nuclear proliferation? All the messages seem to show the benefits of maybe having nuclear weapons. We know people like North Korea look at Gaddafi going down the pan, having given away his, Saddam Hussein, Iran are looking at this. Do you feel this has enhanced or given a greater boost to people wanting to get nuclear weapons?
Mark?
It may well, unfortunately. There is this narrative that says, well, if only Ukraine had not given up its nuclear, or its share of the Soviet nuclear weapons that it inherited in 1991 too, then it wouldn't be in this position. I mean, that forgets the fact that the weapons happened to be on Ukrainian soil, but Ukraine did not have the launch codes, the launch systems. It didn't have any of the panoply of additional capabilities to actually use them. But the trouble is, politics and reality don't always see eye to eye. So yes, I mean, I think this continues to push that narrative. And again, this is one of the reasons why it is so important that we do support Ukraine. If we allow the creation of a notion that basically each country is on its own, even when it faces entirely illegitimate attack, then that becomes a justification for taking the weapons of mass destruction route. In some ways, I mean, this is not in any way the primary reason why, but a byproduct of the fact that we are supporting Ukraine is also a way of saying, well, this is actually why law is also a powerful way of helping maximize your defenses. You don't have to just simply rely on a nuclear capacity or similar.
Okay, thank you. Sir, there's a lady, I will come back to you in a moment. Sir, you're first.
Thank you, Ali Bahajub, North-South Publications. 2 days ago, the European Union leadership said that they would help the Ukrainians export their grain. How could they do that? And bearing in mind that the ports are actually blocked. Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, but I may be wrong. You mentioned about the website Global Security Strategy Forum. It's actually Global Strategy Forum, not Security Forum.
I beg your pardon.
Thank you.
Thank you. It is written in our material. Yes, Global Security Forum. Thank you. Global Strategy Forum. I know what I'm talking about. Yes, Odessa is blockaded. The tiny amounts of grain can get out by road to Romania. Unless there is sea transport, then this grain, these millions of tons of grain, are not going to go anywhere pretty soon.
Yeah, I mean, there's also railway, but again, that is already fully used up. I think one of the points that this comes down to is, I mean, the Russians are blockading the port of Odessa, but to a large extent, they're not doing it in a sort of direct, kinetic way. Yes, sometimes they have ships out there. It's more that actually no one can get insurance. No commercial ship is going to be insured to go there. And so the Russians can just sit back and just simply with the capability of sinking such a ship. Now, that creates opportunities if we really want to test it. Insurance can also be weaponized. What we could do is precisely guarantee that those ships are going to be underwritten essentially by states, rather than just simply having to take it to Lloyd's of London. Things like that. Again, I mean, at the moment, we haven't really sort of moved. I think, and again, it's not a criticism. There's obviously priorities, but I think we can be a lot more imaginative about how we address what is at the moment absolutely a stranglehold, which is going to lead to, apart from the impacts in terms of global hunger, but there's also the fact that Ukraine's economy could shrink by 50% of GDP this year.
Yeah. Peter, is there any constituency, do you think, for creating a sort of UN routes from Odessa to Romanian ports that can handle bulk grain?
I honestly don't know, Michael. All I can add anecdotally is that flying over the Bosphorus 10 days ago, it was very striking that whereas normally you've got masses of boats either end of the straits waiting, queuing up to go through, there was almost nothing there at all. A lot of the maritime trade going through the Bosphorus has dried up, possibly for reasons of insurance, possibly for others. Turkey, of course, relies an awful lot on Ukrainian wheat. So do many other emerging economies and developing countries to keep their food prices under control. A lot of people have got every interest in doing something about that, but I honestly don't know. I don't know whether it is possible to get the grain out of the ports, which are currently being either occupied or blockaded by the Russians. It's above my pay grade, I'm sorry.
Yes. No, nobody can think of an easy one on the easy answer to that. Right, there was sorry, somebody at the back there, yes, madam, who was sitting next to Lord West. I kept seeing your hand.
Thank you. Valentina Barbacci, advisor to various social enterprises and foundations. We talked about the effectiveness of sanctions, and I would like to bring to bear here that human trafficking is an issue that is huge in this current environment, in that Ukraine is a major source, transit, and destination country for human trafficking. One child is deemed by certain sources to be valued at $150,000 US dollars, according to some sources.
This is before the war you're talking about now?
Yes, exactly. Yes, an average child.
In any case, before the conflict, yeah.
Yeah, and even presently. And there will be millions to choose from, as we know, given the current refugee crisis that's presenting itself. This is a business opportunity, essentially, for a number of different countries, including Russia and other neighboring countries. So to what extent, my question is, are banks effectively actually cutting off the funding? A lot of money, human trafficking money, flows both knowingly and unknowingly through banks who profit enormously from this kind of trade. And to what extent are they not stopping this flow of funds? And to what extent are we dealing with, both in the UK and other Western countries, dealing with this issue, given that our security forces have been severely undercut in recent years and can barely handle the situation here? Human trafficking has risen by 25% in the UK alone under the pandemic. So I would be very grateful. Does it fuel Russia in ways, and other countries in ways that we are not currently dealing with?
Understood. So, Peter, the Ukraine was hardly a paragon of Western law and values and economic probity before the crisis. We lionize Ukraine now because of this David and Goliath struggle, but we shouldn't be under any illusions as to the way the state was going. Indeed, I mean, electing an actor was almost, to president, was almost like an act of despair. Well, why not? How much worse could he be than all of these corrupt politicians we have had?
Yes, and other countries have also, elected actors and found that they've ended up being heads of government.
Yeah.
You're quite right, of course. Ukraine is not a paragon of virtue. It had a great deal of corruption. There was plenty of money laundering going on there. There were even worse things going on in the areas which were largely under Russian control over the last 8 years, over in the east. And we need to remember that there were a lot of bad things going on there. You're right. Because of the invasion, suddenly we all love Ukraine, and I like to think that we are not under illusion, any illusion as to what kind of governance there is there and the way the country functions. There are definitely black market and trafficking organizations thriving there. What I don't know is whether that continues to be the case. There is clearly a lot of worry that amongst the large numbers of refugees who've come across the border, notably into Poland, that there are human traffickers exploiting those Ukrainians. And sometimes Ukraine was, if you like, the transit country, but I think now it is potentially the victim country. There are people making promises which sound credible, and people are desperate, and they are signing up for a future which is not much short of human slavery, with a lot of very unscrupulous gangs operating in other countries which are bordering Ukraine. How do we manage that? Well, a lot of the not-for-profit and humanitarian organizations which are trying to help those refugees are obviously looking at it closely. Governments which are welcoming Ukrainians to come into their countries are having to look quite carefully at who they're getting. The British government's getting a lot of stick, some of it justifiable, some of it I suspect not, for being a bit slow with granting the visas after the trumpeting of the Ukrainians for Families program. But we do need to have a look at this, and we do need in all of our countries to look very carefully at the risk that there is human trafficking going on just below the surface of what looks like an admirable humanitarian operation.
Yeah. Thank you. We just passed the microphone to Lord Hannay while I ask Mark just for a comment on the trafficking.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing when it comes to Russia is that, first of all, the routes out of Russia are much more constrained now. You can't fly to Europe and so forth. Secondly, the banking connections are also vastly more limited, which actually seems to be, and it's still very kind of preliminary, but the data seems to suggest that if anything, actually trafficking routes via Russia are reducing. If you look, for example, at the heroin trade, Russia had become an increasingly important route for Afghan heroin, the so-called northern route, going through into Europe. Well, now precisely the gangsters are realizing it's a bit trickier to actually move the drugs. It's a bit trickier also to convert it to cash and bring that home. And also they used to rely on the fact that there was a perfectly chummy relationship between Russian and Ukrainian gangsters. So a lot of it was just simply sort of trafficked very neatly through Ukraine. Well, given that none of those still apply, actually we're seeing sort of heroin increasingly shifting back down to the southern route via Iran and the Balkans. So I have a suspicion, and it's no more than a suspicion, that again, likewise with people trafficking, at the moment it's not really a good place to be involved in transnational criminal flows.
Okay, Lord Hannay, sir.
Yes, I wonder if we could go back to something both of you touched on, which was the difficulty the West is having in rallying large parts of the rest of the world to its point of view in this matter. Does it not occur to you that actually we're going back to a very old paradigm, which was called the nonaligned movement, who spent the whole of the First Cold War playing us off against the Russians and at some stage the Chinese, and are probably going back to that rule book? But if that's the case, would our analysis not lead us to the view that they may talk big about anti-imperialism, but they're very, very careful to not step on the toes of the main Western powers? So they basically are playing a double-double game. Could you comment on that? And could you also comment on whether you think we, the West, that is, the United States obviously principally, but others, should be playing a little bit more hardball with some of these countries who actually depend on us coming to their help if something nasty happens to them. Not publicly, that will be counterproductive, but should we be finding ways of getting the message home that if they want help in certain circumstances, they need to give it?
Okay, I'm going to ask Sir Peter to talk about the non-aligned movement and Mark to talk about Hardball, and then Tony Brenton will probably have the last question, I think. Sir Peter.
Well, I'm sure you're right, David, that we're back to the future in the sense of the days of the non-aligned behaving in the way that you described. Is it double bluff? Yes, I suspect there's a certain amount of that. Some of this is posturing. Some of the governments which have sat on their hands and declined to condemn the invasion of Ukraine, they've done that, or abstained rather than voted the other way, for reasons of economic pressure, as I was saying, optics, to some extent domestic public opinion, and not wishing to alienate or interrupt supplies of vital goods coming from Russia, China, and elsewhere. Should we be trying to put a bit more pressure on those who are, if you like, not realizing where their real interests lie? There's talk of that at the moment over Turkey, as President Erdogan, as we were talking about just now, suggests that he doesn't want the two new member states, the two candidate countries, to join NATO. And some of the comment at the bottom of the newspaper articles that I was reading online this morning is full of stuff about why don't we throw Turkey out of NATO and bring in the nice Finns and Swedes. Well, you can't actually do that. That's not the way the alliance works. But that's the sort of sentiment. There is a feeling that Turkey needs to know which side its bread is buttered on. Turks, of course, and Turkish government would see things in rather a different way. But I do think that there are ways in which America, in particular, can have some say on this. Tony Blinken and Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, the Turkish foreign minister, are meeting tomorrow, and maybe they'll be able to iron out some of these things. But of course, some of America's traditional leverage in Turkey has gone because they're squabbling about other issues where the Turks are feeling aggrieved, and it'll be a complicated conversation. The last thing I would just add very briefly on the Gulf states and the Gulf Arabs all, again, sat on their hands, which is not what you would expect given who they rely on for their security. I think one thing has changed a little bit in the last few years, which is after, amongst other things, those very precise Iranian Revolutionary Guard attacks on Saudi oil production facilities, which did not destroy everything because there weren't any warheads on them, but we all saw the little holes in the top of the domes of those production facilities, was a very clear warning from Iran. We know where you live and we can do you a lot of damage. There was no American response. And I think that's one reason why some of the Gulf states are beginning to say to themselves, are we really sure we can rely on Uncle Sam at a time when both Trump and Biden have been elected by Americans who do not wish to get involved in faraway wars, spending lots of blood and treasure on somebody else's security issues. They are now beginning to have to talk to each other. Israelis are talking to Arabs, Saudis are talking to Iranians. A lot of stuff is going on a regional basis, which I think is thoroughly welcome. But it may mean that we have a little bit less pressure. Look at the relationship at the moment between Biden and the ruling family in Saudi Arabia than we had before.
Okay, I'm going to go straight to Tony Brenton for our final question, I think, and which will have to be brief, as will the answers. Tony.
Maybe comment. Okay, thank you. No, we'll be very brief.
Ex-ambassador to Russia, I have to say.
Yes. Yeah. And it's basically a question for you, Peter, and following up on David's question, in fact. Pretty clear, as Mark says, this is going to go on for a long time. It's going to settle into it's going to bog down into a stalemate. Sanctions are going to sit there. Pretty clearly, the Russians are going to be looking to shift their oil, their gas, a lot of their other trade east, and in particular to China and India. So my question is, to what extent are the Americans really likely to use secondary sanctions to bash the Chinese and the Indians to stop them getting into this trade? Put the question another way, to what extent are they prepared to seriously bend their relationships with China, fairly easy, but India, much harder, out of shape, in order to hit Ukraine?
Okay, that's the hard-ball question. Mark, get a quick comment on that, and then a quick comment from Peter on that.
Well, whether or not the Americans are going to do it, I have absolutely no idea. I'm not an Americanist, I'm glad to say. But I think that this absolutely sort of raises one key point, is actually about the fact that interdependence has become the new battlefield. And that just as we complain about the fact that, for example, we become dependent on Russian oil and gas and on Chinese manufacturing and so forth, these are also the things that give us leverage with these powers. And I think this is going to be one of the key challenges of the next few years, is actually how we calibrate.
Okay, Peter, one sentence.
I think the impact of American sanctions on the global financial system through the dollar, through the weaponization, if you like, of the dollar, will continue to have a very considerable effect on Russia's ability to export its stuff to anybody. Equally, I don't think they're going to start trying to put heavy sanctions on China because it simply won't work. Sanctions, international sanctions work when China and or Russia go along with it voluntarily, as they did for a while on Iran, but don't anymore. So I think that's probably a bridge too far. I think they will be looking for other means of trying to bring pressure to bear.
Okay, thank you. On that phrase, a bridge too far, we have to call it to a close. Thank you all for your participation here. Remember that the next meeting is on the 22nd of June, 10:30, talking about weaponizing migration. But for now, let me offer on your behalf my thanks to Professor Mark Galeotti and Sir Peter Westmacott for what I think has been an excellent presentation on the weaponization of everything and how does this war end. Thank you all very much. Good afternoon.